On March 12, 2026, the sheriff of Pima County sat down with an NBC News correspondent and said something that should have stopped this entire country cold. He said investigators had known the motive behind Nancy Guthrie's disappearance since day one, since the very first hours, and that belief had never changed across more than 40 days of evidence collection, forensic analysis, and public silence. 46 days, no arrest, no named suspect, one woman, 84 years old, still missing. And the man running the investigation was telling the country he had known why it happened from the beginning. Those two things cannot both be true in the way most people assume they are. Either the sheriff knew something and sat on it, or the word knew is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. But there is a third possibility. It is the one the evidence actually points toward. The FBI did the work. The FBI found the evidence. And somewhere between what the Bureau found and what the public was told, a decision was made that cost this investigation time it could not afford to lose. In the next 15 minutes, I am going to show you exactly what the FBI found inside Nancy Guthrie's home, what they were blocked from doing with it, and why the gap between that evidence and an arrest is the real story of this case. Before we go any further, if you are new here, Notebook VE is where we slow down and actually read what law enforcement is not saying out loud. Hit subscribe and tap the bell, because when this case breaks, you will want to be the first to know. Now, let's build this from the ground up. Nancy Guthrie had lived in the same house in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona for more than 50 years. The neighborhood sits in the desert north of the city. Streets are wide and quiet, houses set back from the road behind driveways and landscaping that create a natural privacy. At night, almost no traffic. Residents have lived there long enough to know each other's routines. Serious crime was not a conversation that came up. That history of safety, built over decades, was precisely the thing that made Nancy vulnerable. She was 84 years old. According to the sheriff in a public statement, she could not walk 50 yards on her own without assistance. She had a pacemaker regulating her heartbeat, and she relied on daily cardiac medication that her daughter Savannah described publicly and plainly as essential to her survival. Not something she could skip for a day, not something that could wait. Medication that, if missed, could begin causing serious deterioration within hours. She was mentally sharp, independent in the ways that mattered to her. She watched church services online each week, following a congregation in New York that Savannah attended, connecting from her living room rather than driving across Tucson. Neighbors told reporters she had not been getting out of the house as much in recent months, that they sometimes worried when they did not see her. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy had dinner at the home of her daughter Annie. They played card games. It was the kind of ordinary evening that leaves no particular trace, unremarkable in every way until it suddenly was not. Annie's husband, Tommaso Cione, drove Nancy home. Surveillance footage confirmed the garage door opened at 9:48 in the evening and closed at 9:50. Tommaso waited until she was inside, then drove away. That was the last confirmed moment anyone in the family saw Nancy safe. The following morning, a friend arrived for their weekly shared church live stream. Nancy did not come to the door. Calls were unanswered. Family members drove to the house. They searched the property. Around noon, they called 911. Deputies arrived at 12:15 in the afternoon, and what they found told them immediately that this was not an elderly woman who had wandered away. The blood was the first thing. Droplets at the front entrance, circular and contained, falling straight down without interruption. No footprints cutting through them, no voids where a shoe had stepped between the drops. The pattern said one thing clearly: someone had been bleeding at that threshold before they were moved. Nancy's Apple Watch was on the counter. Her cardiac medication was on the counter. Her wallet untouched. Her phone on the counter. And the doorbell camera that normally hung beside the front door, gone. Not broken, not obscured, physically removed from its mount and taken. It had gone offline at 1:47 in the morning, not from a power failure, from a gloved hand that studied it, blocked the lens with vegetation pulled from the garden bed, and then detached the entire device from its mount. The person who did that wore a full-face black ski mask, black gloves, light-colored pants, a dark jacket, and a black Ozark Trail 25-liter hiking pack on his back. He had a holstered firearm strapped to the front of his body, centered on the chest, not at the hip. He held a penlight between his teeth to keep both hands free. He walked directly toward the camera with the calm of someone who had thought about this moment before arriving at it. At 2:12 in the morning, a second camera on the property registered a motion detection event. No video, because the subscription tier did not include recording, but a time-stamped confirmation that something was moving at that location. At 2:28 in the morning, the Bluetooth connection between Nancy's pacemaker and her iPhone dropped. Bluetooth operates within approximately 30 feet. When that signal went silent, Nancy was no longer inside her home. She was outside, in a vehicle, gone. The entire window, from camera removal to pacemaker silence, 41 minutes. 8 minutes after the pacemaker went dark, a vehicle of unknown make and model was captured on a Ring camera 2.5 miles away. And from that moment forward, the physical trail of Nancy Guthrie ends. The blood on that porch was already telling forensic experts something, but what the FBI found inside the house would become the most important piece of evidence in this entire investigation. Inside Nancy Guthrie's home, they collected DNA. Not Nancy's, not belonging to any family member or confirmed regular contact. DNA from strangers, from people who had been physically present inside that house during those 41 minutes. And not one stranger, two. The sample was a mixed profile, genetic material from at least two unidentified individuals layered together in a single collection. Sheriff Nanos confirmed this publicly on March 12, 2026, in his interview with NBC News. He acknowledged the mixed samples were creating significant technical challenges and that resolving them could take weeks, months, or longer. The FBI ran those profiles against CODIS, the national DNA database holding more than 26 million genetic records. No match. The two people who left their DNA inside Nancy Guthrie's home had either never been arrested or had never had their DNA entered into the federal system. They were unknown, but they existed. And the science that identifies people from their genetic material, even when they have never appeared in any database, had already been applied to cases far colder than this one. The same technique that identified the Golden State Killer after more than 4 decades. The same technique that identified Brian Kohberger in the Idaho student murders within weeks. Investigative genetic genealogy does not need the suspect to be in the system. It needs a relative, anyone who shares enough genetic markers to point toward a common ancestor in a public platform, like 23andMe or Ancestry. Forensic genealogists then build a family tree from that partial overlap, narrowing by geography, by age, by physical description, until they arrive at a specific individual. The FBI knew exactly where this evidence needed to go. They requested it, and they were told no. The FBI wanted the DNA samples and the black gloves recovered near the scene sent to the National Crime Laboratory at Quantico, Virginia, the most advanced forensic processing facility in the country, direct access to the genetic genealogy infrastructure that had solved cases measuring decades in age. Sheriff Chris Nanos of Pima County declined. The evidence went instead to DNA Labs International, a private laboratory in Deerfield Beach, Florida, with which Pima County held a long-standing contract. Pima County had reportedly spent approximately $200,000 sending evidence to that Florida lab. Nanos defended the decision publicly, saying he wanted all evidence held in a single location, alongside existing DNA profiles already in the system, so that comparisons could be properly cross-referenced. He denied emphatically that he had blocked the FBI from anything. A federal official speaking to Reuters described the decision as risking further slowing a case that grows more urgent by the minute. A source who spoke to News Nation was less measured. That source called it dumb, called it insane, said the Bureau would likely have to retrieve the evidence from Florida and retest it from the beginning, adding time to a process where time was the one thing Nancy Guthrie did not have. And the DNA lab was not the only place this investigation lost ground it could not recover. When deputies first processed the front porch, the crime scene was released in under 20 hours. Reporters from a local Arizona news outlet walked to the front door and filmed the blood droplets. A nationally significant forensic environment, the physical threshold where an 84-year-old woman had been taken from her home, was accessible to camera crews before the FBI had conducted a comprehensive sweep. When asked later whether he would have handled it differently, Nanos said, "Monday morning quarterback, absolutely. I probably could have held off on that." A retired NYPD detective said investigators had probably dropped the ball a little bit in releasing that crime scene too early. A former deputy sheriff who had served alongside Nanos for decades before retiring told the Daily Mail the case should have been handed to federal authorities at least 2 weeks earlier than it was. He described Nanos as a classic micromanager. And while all of this was unfolding, Nanos told the public on February 2nd that there was no danger to the community, no cause for concern. 40 days later, in that same NBC News interview where he claimed to have known the motive from day one, he said the suspect could absolutely strike again and warned the public, "Don't think for a minute that because it happened to the Guthrie family, you're safe." Both of those statements came from the same man. Neither of them can be reconciled with the other without asking what exactly he knew, when he knew it, and why the gap between those two public positions stretched across 40 days of silence. Then, the ransom notes arrived. The first reached a Tucson news station through an online tip portal on February 1st, the same day Nancy was reported missing. Then a second, then a third, each one sent to a media outlet rather than directly to the family, each one demanding millions of dollars in Bitcoin, each one setting a deadline that would pass without consequence. FBI Special Agent in Charge Haith Janai confirmed publicly that 2 specific details in those notes had not been made public at the time they arrived. The first was a reference to Nancy's Apple Watch and its location inside the house. The second was a reference to 2 broken floodlights in the rear of the property, dangling from wires in the backyard, not visible from any public vantage point, not mentioned in any news coverage that preceded the note. Both details confirmed accurate. Both details could only have been known by someone who had been inside that house. The notes were assessed as legitimate. The family said publicly they were willing to pay. Savannah Guthrie recorded a video appeal coordinated with FBI negotiators, addressing whoever was holding her mother directly. Cameron Guthrie, a military pilot who had said almost nothing publicly through the entire ordeal, recorded his own appeal at the first deadline. $6 million was demanded. The money was available, and the person who had written notes with inside knowledge of a broken backyard floodlight and the exact placement of an Apple Watch inside Nancy Guthrie's home never wrote again. No proof of life, no instructions, no response to any appeal the family made. The silence was immediate and complete. If you're watching this and thinking, why hasn't any mainstream outlet put this together like this? That is exactly why this channel exists. Share this video with one person following the case. One share is how investigations like this get the pressure they deserve. Now, let's talk about where the evidence actually stands right now. Former FBI Deputy Assistant Director John Miller looked at this evidence and said something that most coverage treated as a sidebar.
He said the crime went wrong immediately, not days later, not after the ransom deadlines passed. Immediately. The moment contact was made with Nancy Guthrie on the night of January 31st, something happened that could not be corrected. And what came after? The notes sent to media outlets, the Bitcoin demands, the inside knowledge deployed in carefully structured language may have been constructed not to recover Nancy Guthrie, but to cover what had already been done to her. Miller used a specific word. He said the crime may have been re-engineered into a kidnapping narrative after something went terribly and irrevocably wrong on that porch. Retired FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffendorfer had been tracking this case publicly since the morning it became news. She spoke to Newsweek. She appeared across national broadcasts and across 41 days of developments and delays and press conferences that contradicted each other. She said exactly what she saw, not what made for a better headline.
On March 10, 2026, she wrote 3 words she had not used once in 6 weeks of covering the case: half glass full. She also wrote that the search phase was over. She did not say they had found Nancy, she said the search phase was over. In the language of federal investigations, that phrase has a specific meaning. When law enforcement declines large-scale volunteer search operations, it is not typically because the case has gone cold. It is because investigators already know something about the victim's location or condition that makes a ground search operationally irrelevant. The search phase ends when the investigation has already moved past the point where finding requires looking. Former FBI agent and CIA officer Tracy Walder approached the same evidence from a different direction. She said the case was too targeted. Someone who had surveilled that house specifically, someone connected through obsession or retaliation, and not to Nancy Guthrie herself, but to Savannah Guthrie. Not the mother, the daughter. Nancy, according to Walder's analysis, was not the true objective. She was the closest and most accessible connection to the person the alleged perpetrator actually cared about. Her age, her limited mobility, her predictable weekly routine, her home that she had lived in for more than 50 years, all of it made her the easiest point of access for someone whose actual target lived in a different city entirely. 3 former federal investigators, 3 independent analytical frameworks, all 3 pointing toward the same conclusion that none of them was willing to state in plain language, but that the evidence underneath each of their statements pointed toward directly. The forensic pipeline in this investigation is not a single track. It is parallel lines running simultaneously, each one designed to arrive at the same destination from a different direction. The DNA collected from inside Nancy's home is being processed through investigative genetic genealogy. The technique does not need the suspect to have a criminal record. It needs a relative, anyone who shares enough genetic material to point toward a common ancestor in a public database, like 23andMe or Ancestry. Forensic genealogists build a family tree from that partial overlap, narrowing by geography, by age, by physical description, until they arrive at a specific individual. Barbara Ray Venter, the genealogist who identified the Golden State Killer, told CNN that patience is often required. Some cases break in less than 8 hours. Others take 2 years. This one is being worked. Cell tower data is a separate track entirely. A phone that is powered on and in range of a tower registers its presence with a timestamp, stored and available to federal investigators with the appropriate warrant. Every device present in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood between the evening of January 31st and the early hours of February 1st left a record. The walkie-talkie carried by the alleged suspect does not appear on cell towers, but the phone of whoever was driving that unidentified vehicle at 2:36 in the morning may have. The black Ozark Trail backpack is sold exclusively at Walmart. The holster was also available at Walmart. FBI agents had been working with Walmart to trace purchases of that specific backpack model in the weeks before the abduction, and had been showing images of the holster to gun stores across Tucson. A cash purchase still generates a transaction log. The register records the time.
The store camera records the buyer. Annie Guthrie's blue Honda CR-V was held in a federal evidence bay for more than 40 days. The delay was because the electronic data download during forensic processing damaged the vehicle's onboard systems, requiring a dealership repair before it could be returned. The car is back, which means the extraction is complete, which means everything the FBI needed from that vehicle is already in a case file that has moved past the collection phase. According to reporting by Cold Case Files USA, an individual named Dominic Evans, described as a 29-year associate of Tommaso Cione, has a documented history of felony convictions for burglary and robbery, and a physical profile that allegedly corresponds at multiple points to the FBI's publicly released description of the person on that porch. Height, build, a tattoo on the right wrist, a pinky ring. Evans is not publicly named as a suspect or a person of interest by any law enforcement agency. That characterization is alleged and has not been confirmed. What is confirmed is this: Derek Kalla, the man arrested on February 5th for sending a fraudulent ransom text to Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cione's private phone numbers, had those numbers. His phone is now inside the federal evidence system. Every contact in it, every communication across the relevant timeline, available to investigators who have been building a forensic and digital case across 6 weeks of parallel processing. The alleged suspect visited Nancy's property on January 11th without equipment, then returned on January 24th, both times on a weekend. That pattern, casing on weekend nights, targeting a single elderly woman with a predictable routine in a quiet neighborhood, reflects what criminologists describe as low-risk victim selection, combined with high-effort pre-operational planning. That combination means the alleged perpetrator was neither impulsive nor experienced. And if Coffindoffer's read on the walkie-talkie is correct, there was coordination. This was not one person acting alone. Understanding that profile, methodical, pre-planned, multi-person, is the difference between treating this as an isolated tragedy and recognizing what Tracy Walder was pointing at when she said this case was too targeted to be random. Nancy Guthrie's cardiac medication was still sitting on her kitchen counter when deputies arrived at 12:15 in the afternoon. Her Apple Watch on the counter, her phone on the counter. She did not pack. She did not choose to leave. 50 years in that house, and she left without a single thing that belonged to her. The science is running. The genealogy is being built. The cell tower records exist. Somewhere in this country, a person is living with the knowledge of what happened in those 41 minutes, watching the reward climb past $1.2 million, watching the FBI return to that neighborhood week after week, and calculating whether silence is still the right decision. If you have information about this case, 1-800-CALL-FBI. Tips can be submitted at tips.fbi.gov. Both are anonymous. A huge thank you to everyone who came over from Audiobook VN. Your support means everything, and it is exactly why we keep going this deep. If this breakdown gave you something the headlines did not, hit like, drop a comment with your thoughts on where this case goes next, and subscribe to Notebook VE. We will be here with the full story before anyone else. See you in the next one.